Good evening, everyone. My name is Connor Moran. I'm the director of the Wisconsin Book Festival. Welcome to the second day of our fall celebration. We are delighted to be joined today by Sarah Hulse and Maxim Loskutoff. We are also joined by Ron Kuka from the UW Program in Creative Writing. It is a wonderful anytime that we can bring together Wisconsin writers, Wisconsin professors, and all things Wisconsin. But today we have kind of an additional layer or layering of overlapping interests where all of our speakers today have a connection to the West. Both Eden Mine and Ruthie Fear take place in the West, and Ron Kuka comes from multiple generations of Western families. So we have a really nice number of different things that we get to talk about today. As we get started, I, as always, want to thank Madison Public Library and the Madison Public Library Foundation for their unwavering support of free cultural events here in Madison via the Wisconsin Book Festival. They have been absolutely stalwart in their support of the festival throughout the pandemic, as they have for the last 8 years. So it is always wonderful to be able to thank them. I also want to thank all of our sponsors for making these events possible. And I want to thank the partnership with the UW Program in Creative Writing. This is one of our Wisconsin Wednesday events, even though it's happening on a Friday, that we've put together throughout the fall and spring semesters this year to be able to bring Wisconsin authors to Wisconsin audiences, whether they're in Reno or here in Madison or wherever they may be. So thank you to the program. Ron, I'll let you be the person who receives that, and you can spread that all around wherever you need to.
Great.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to turn it over to the authors and the professors, and I'll see you at the end. Bye-bye.
Great. Hello, everybody. I'm very, very pleased to be here today to talk about two wonderful books with their writers. My name is Ron Kuka. I'm the program coordinator for the program in creative writing here at the University of Wisconsin. And I have to say, just as an aside before I start, I'm kind of known for going on in introductions, so I promised to keep this very short and to step out of the way. So in essence, I'm just going to read their book jackets and then give each of the authors an opportunity to read from their books. And then after that, I've got a few questions I'm hoping will spur some questions from the audience as well. So without further ado, I think I'm going to introduce Sarah Hulse, because that's what I promised earlier. But her first novel, Black River, which I've read, and is a terrific novel as well, was a Penn Hemingway Award for Debut Fiction finalist, an Amazon Best Book of the Month, an ALA Notable Book, an ABA Indies Introduced Title, an Indie Next Pick, and winner of the Reading of the West Award. She received her MFA from the University of Oregon and was a fiction fellow here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. An avid horsewoman, she has lived throughout the American West. So, hi, Sarah. So actually, why don't we do this? So why don't you read, and then I'll introduce Max. That way we can attach the biography to the work. All right.
Okay. So I'm going to read just a short section from Eden Mine, my new book. And I don't have to do too much introduction here. I'm going to read just the first couple pages here. And this book essentially it's set in Montana, and it's about a young woman whose brother has committed an act of domestic terrorism, and he's gone into hiding. She may or may not know where he is. That's one of the central questions in the novel. And as I said, I'm just going to read from the very beginning here so you can get a sense of how we start off. My brother's bomb explodes at 10:16 on a late April Sunday morning. I don't know. I'm 150 miles northwest in the house he and I share. I've just taped together the first cardboard moving box, and it sits on the hardwood before me, yawning empty. Later, I'll imagine the explosion with such regularity and intensity that details become etched in my mind alongside my own memories, sharp-edged and indelible. I'll be hounded by those details, haunted. The shattering glass, thousands of jagged pieces slicing the air, capturing and fracturing the light. The enormity of the sound, the brute physicality of it, and then its numbing absence. The clouding dust, the crumbling rubble, the blood. But at 10:16, I know nothing, packing my biggest problem. 12 injured, 1 critically. A child, the daughter of the pastor of the church across the street from the bomb. Services barely begun, only the first hymn sung, the first reading spoken. The child's father prays over her for the 3 minutes it takes her to lose consciousness, for the 4 minutes more it takes the paramedics to arrive. He cradles her as he prays, and he'll find flecks of red on his skin and under his nails for days afterward. So much blood, he will say, so fast. I don't know any of this. There's no tingle at the back of my neck, no sudden catch of breath at the moment of detonation. I have no idea. None, until the radio cuts off the newest country star in the midst of his climb up the weekly countdown, replaces his easy twang with the clipped voice of a reporter. If my gut contracts when I hear the word courthouse, it is only because we got bad news there not long ago. If I try calling Samuel's cell phone and then try again and again, it is simply because a person wants to talk to family after a disaster like this, and he is the only family I have. And if what I feel when the knock comes and I open the door to the sheriff is not exactly surprise, well, that's just the shock. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. I'm gonna do this. This is what my students do as a way of plotting over the Zoom. That's terrific, Sarah. Thank you. Now on to Maxim, and here's his bio. Raised in a small town in the West, Maxim Loskutoff, I butchered it, I'm sorry, Loskutoff, is the critically acclaimed author of Ruthie Fear and Come West and See, an NPR and Amazon Best Book of 2018, a New York Times editor's pick, and winner of the High Plains Book Award. His stories and essays have appeared in numerous periodicals, including the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, Plowshares, and Playboy. He lives in the Rocky Mountains of Western Montana. Welcome, Max.
Thank you so much, Ron, and thank you also, Sarah. It's such an honor to be here reading and talking with you guys today. And first, I'm going to give just a tiny bit of background on Ruthie Fear, and it's been such an interesting experience to me having the book come out and doing these events in this sort of strange new world where I'm sitting in my little writing studio in Montana and speaking to people in Wisconsin and all over the world potentially. And it really kind of fits in with the book because I think the experience of writing the book for me was writing about a place, and it's set in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana, which is right near where I grew up and where I've spent a lot of time, was the experience of living on a place that feels like it's on the precipice in some sort of very deep and fundamental way, which really was my experience growing up in Montana. I was a kid there in the 90s, and there always was sort of a sense of impending doom. But this past year is kind of the first experience with doom. We're kind of in the middle of doom. And, for me, there's kind of a tremendous amount of suffering, but there's also a tremendous amount of possibility in that and potential for a different kind of future. And sort of the arc of the novel is the story of a person who, when they're born, Ruthie has this very deep and innate connection to the natural world that surrounds her, and a real understanding that there is so much more to it than she can really see or understand. And so all through her childhood, she's seeing things and she's not sure if they're real or not, that no one else is seeing. And then over the course of her life, as she's kind of like pulled out of that, as she gets older, she gets pulled deeper and deeper into the sort of the world of men and the world of the modern world. And kind of the arc of the book is her attempting to find her way back to that state of oneness and of kind of understanding that she had, and coming to learn whether the things that she saw were real or not. And so I'm going to read the second chapter from Ruthie Fear, which takes place when Ruthie is 5. It's the first time her father takes her out hunting and she sees something in the sky. The first time Ruthie Fear went hunting with her father, she saw a huge winged skeleton flying in from the north. It approached over the dawn-lit mountains, wings stretched across the horizon, undulating on currents of air. Each bone rose and fell discreetly, hinged together like vertebra and marked by shafts of light. The skull pointed toward her, its shadow slid over the earth. An alien, Ruthie was sure, some creature that glided from world to world on gravitational tides and had died in between, the heat of 1,000 suns slowly stripping away its flesh. Only 5, she felt the vastness of the universe, saw herself as a single dot, imagined skimming through the cosmos beside this hunter without fear or hunger, passing strange worlds and towering nebulae of green and purple gas millions of miles across. Her father's Auto 5 shotgun broke her reverie and shattered the skeleton into a mass of flapping, twisting parts. One tumbled down to the ice-covered pond before them. It landed silently in a puff of snow. The rest of the flock reassembled, carried on, and were lost in the shadow of the Sapphire Mountains. Her father cursed and lowered the gun. White frost clung to his red beard. Pulled too early, he said. His orange cap was the brightest piece of the morning world. Ruthie struggled to understand, one moment the skeleton, the next a dying goose. Smoke threaded up from the gun barrel and a mirror of her father's breath. The goose dragged itself across the ice with a broken wing, making not for the shore but the center, as though it would be met there in safety by a healing force. The cold air stung Ruthie's throat. Sudden warmth ached behind her eyes. She mourned the loss of the winged skeleton much more than the goose dying in front of her. The impossible distances it had crossed, the freedom to move from galaxy to galaxy, feeding on light, while her own life was confined to the trailer she shared with her father and the valley that surrounded them. The goose collapsed. Only its unbroken wing continued to beat weakly against the ice in steady, desperate cadence. Her father cursed again. He breached the stock and emptied the spent shells into the snow. Point away, he said, handing Ruthie the shotgun. Not at me, not at you. Ruthie gripped the warm barrel to her chest. She wished the skeleton had passed overhead, that it had streamed on to Las Vegas or Cancun or one of the other exotic places populated by bikini-clad women on the posters on her father's bedroom wall. He was only 24, not much more than a child himself. He turned and picked his way down through the brush to the edge of the pond. He paused on the shore, his eyes narrowed against the cold, his eyebrows drawn together in determination. Never do this, he said. He lay down on his stomach and spread his arms, paused there for a moment, a supplicant, flattened with his chin to the snow, then pushed off the snowy bank with his legs and slowly pulled himself over the creaking surface by the elbows. His arms in a crooked V above his head, his body flat, one ear cocked to the shifting sounds beneath. Heat seemed to ribbon off him, an invader on the blank white void, only the goose also moving within it. The wing beat like a heart. Whomp, whomp, whomp. Slowing, failing, a bloody motor running down. A trickle of red reached out to meet her father, to guide him as a serpent to its lair. Ruthie wanted to scream, but she was afraid even that sound would crack the ice. She held her breath. Her father inched farther out, 10 feet from the shore, 20. His gloved hand reached for the bird's black foot, nearly touched it, when a sound like another gunshot split the morning, and 2 white walls tipped up to form a canyon, sluicing both man and bird into the dark water below. Then flopping back to horizontal, only the jagged vein between the sheets revealing the break. For a moment, Ruthie did not move or scream. She was trapped between reality and her imagination. What had been real? Her father on the ice or lost in the dark water below? The flying skeleton or the flock of geese? Her booted feet in snow or skimming along beside a huge winged creature in the black of space? The ice violently upended into a mountain, and her father's orange hat burst forth. Icy water gushed off his cheeks. He howled. His arm thrashed free from the water, holding the struggling bird by the feet. He flung it toward Ruthie. It skidded into the snowbank on the shore. It looked oddly unharmed there, only dazed, with all the blood washed from its feathers and its wound temporarily frozen shut. Rutherford brought his elbows down onto the ice, breaking it again. He twisted his shoulders like a bear and lurched toward Ruthie. She stood frozen in terror, holding the shotgun. His approach was relentless, smashing through the ice and the waist-high water, his face contorted, monstrous, beastly, a killer who would kill again. For an instant, she was so afraid that she thought to level the barrel to her father's chest, pull the trigger, and send him back beneath the ice. Sealed above his head, the massive skeleton once again winging south across the sky. Thank you.
Thank you. More clicking. Thanks, Max. Well, I thought we'd start with Sarah. Here's a question for you, Sarah, and it has to do with Joe, your main character here. For those of you who don't know, Jo is paraplegic. She's been wounded and is now negotiates her life on a wheelchair, including living on a ranch. One of the best scenes in my mind in the book is one where she's crossed a creek to take a ride on her mule, favorite mule. The tree comes down during a big storm across the bridge. She finds no way back. But to my mind, that's the only part of the novel really where her physical challenges seem to carry a lot of weight for us. She just goes about her life in a very matter-of-fact way. So my question, Sarah, is you have a character who's dealing with significant emotional trauma from the accident as well as what's happened with Samuel. And a kind of a chicken and egg question is, when you conceived of Jo, did you imagine her from the beginning in a wheelchair, or did this idea of somebody who's connected to kind of right-wing groups in Montana come first?
You know, it is a little bit of a chicken or the egg thing, probably hard to pin down exactly. You know, one aspect of it, I think, is that I am really interested in kind of the ways the myths and the stories that we tell or have been told about the West impact those of us who grow up in the West today. Right. To what degree have we maybe like internalized some of those stories, some of which might be true and some of which might not be true. And I think all of the characters, or at least most of the characters in Eden Mine, are kind of playing that out to some extent. You know, Samuel, the older brother, you know, is very much kind of invested in the independent spirit of the West, the frontier mentality, being the, you know, protector of his younger sister, Jo. But he takes that to such extremes that he becomes involved in these extremist politics and you know, very fringe groups. And so one of the things that has interested me, not just in Eden Mine, but I think in my previous novel, Black River, and in some of the things I'm working on now, is a question of disability in the West. You know, it's a place so associated with independent spirit, being able to go out and connect with the land. And I think we make assumptions then that certain people, you know, can't do those things. So Jo was really interesting to write because, you know, we see other characters in the novel make assumptions about her, you know, which is an experience I think many people living with disability or mobility limitations experience. It's one of the reasons in the novel that as a reader, we don't know that Jo is disabled until another character notices this about her. It's, I think, you know, 15 pages or so into the novel. She's the narrator. Her experience of living with a spinal cord injury has been part of her experience for a long time. She was injured as a child. She's a young woman now. So this is not something she is thinking about every moment of every day. It's not the primary way she, you know, defines herself or identifies herself. And I think we see her be very clear-eyed in the novel about what her limitations are and aren't. And they're not necessarily what people expect. You know, she doesn't, in that scene you're talking about where she realizes, you know, the bridge has been damaged and she can't get back to the house. It's, you know, she doesn't really question that. She acknowledges pretty much right away, well, shoot, I'm in trouble now. And one of the tensions there, of course, is that ordinarily she could have relied on her brother Samuel to help her, and he's now gone. But at other times, you know, people are amazed. They find out she still rides. She rides her mule. She rides alone. And everyone wants to sort of react as though this is amazing or inspirational. And she kind of resists that. It's just, it's something that was important to her, and she found a way to do it and was able to do that. So I really liked being able to, I knew in this book I did want to explore some of these questions of these ideas about the West, these myths about the West, who is a Westerner? At what point can those traits that we often see as positive tip into something problematic, which we kind of look at through Samuel? And so I think Jo, in some ways, is just another aspect of that. She is in many ways kind of a stereotypical Westerner, despite the surprise that some people would feel that she's doing those things while also using a wheelchair. She's negotiating a bit with those expectations for Western women where, you got to be able to go out and do the kind of rough and tumble outdoors things while still be, feminine in sort of culturally expected ways. And she is negotiating those same things, not just as a woman in the West, but as someone who also uses a wheelchair, and then people impact that. So I think it just added another facet. And I mean, I certainly conceived of that aspect of her character very early on. I think it adds to those emotional pressures you mentioned. As independent as she is, she has relied for most of her life on her older brother. He has made sure to look out for her. He has done the things for her that she cannot do. There's a moment in the book where she realizes he knew he was going to go commit this act, and she realizes it because he had brought a bunch of feed down out of the loft of their barn. And it's kind of a devastating moment for her because she sees that he was looking out for her even in those moments. But now she's facing this future without him, and she's really having to reckon with what that means to be alone, not just emotionally, but physically.
I actually love the fact that she's in that particular scene is very practical and not careless. I remember when she's considering her options there, she's looking at the house across the creek. And my thought was, oh, Sarah, don't put her in the water. Please don't put her in the water. No, she's such a likable, interesting character. Thank you for that. A question for you, Max, with Ruthie. I have here, Ruthie Fear's book ended with the appearance of a headless, absolutely frightening creature. Creatures, actually, that seemed to be something spawned by a nightmare. Most of Ruthie's story in the center is really told with a tone some people might describe as traditional realism. And I'd like to know, at what point did you decide to make this creatures an integral part of the novel? Was it from the get-go you thought, oh, yeah, I've got this thing, I really need to use it? Or did you find it in the course of the writing?
Yeah, it was really there from the very beginning. I think that the creatures were why I was actually able to finish the book in an interesting way. I think one of the hardest things for me when I was starting as a writer, coming from the West, was trying to figure out what I had to say that hadn't been said 1,000 times before. Trying to figure out where I could fit into all the literature that I had sort of devoured as a kid growing up in Montana. And when I was in my mid-20s, I was living in New York, and so I was kind of like looking back on Montana from a distance and reading about it. And one thing that suddenly became very clear to me was that none of the books I had ever read sort of had captured the feeling of sort of immense, almost fantastical possibility that I felt every time I was a kid walking alone in the woods, And so the experience for me of growing up in rural Montana was, on the one hand, having this, very, kind of gritty, realist experience of the small town West, which also, didn't quite fit in. It certainly didn't fit in with the mythology that Sarah mentioned in her answer as well, because there were just so many sort of different kinds of tensions right under the surface of it. So there was that aspect, and then there was this aspect of almost sort of fantastical possibility and the feeling that literally anything could happen one moment to the next when I was out in the woods. And so the first scene I wrote with Ruthie was her interacting with a creature in the woods. And it was I had tried to write novels before, but this was the first one I managed to finish. And I think that part of the reason why was because I was just so fascinated by, you know, by that interaction, by the way that this element could be spun into a realist world. And it, you know, it also felt, I think it's always felt important to me, because I definitely agree and echo what Sarah said about, you know, the mythology of the West and how so many people are sort of living their own version of it. And particularly how so much writing, even when it is pretending not to, is sort of recycling a lot of the tropes. And I really wanted to write a Western without a hero in the final say. You know, I didn't want any, you know, the lone gunman to ride into town and defeat the bad guys and then everything is okay again. And so as the creature in the novel developed, what really became clear to me was that what these creatures represented for me were forces that were so much bigger than anyone in this valley. That were forces that moved at a pace with a, you know, multi-generational slowness, you know, kind of representative of the natural world that we live in. And so, yeah, as the book went along, you know, it really was sort of what kept me locked in the story, because before this I'd written short stories, and what really sort of kept me so deeply locked into Ruthie's world was the both the exploring the real aspects of it and the way in which she was aware and interacting with these much larger forces.
Right. Yeah, I thought it was very interesting too at the beginning of the book, where she's, I think, more profoundly alone. I mean, I left some early scenes. She and her father build a blind, which is just a spot, a box, basically, away from the house where she can sit and observe the animals. And she's the sort of person who will just sit there for hours and hours and hours. And the way that she's, I think, absorbing everything that's going on around her was very instructive to her character. She seems then to move to a much more, I mean, after she goes to school and has all these different friendships, her focus seems to change somewhat, which leads me to my next question. In reading the book, I think I understood your point about how so much of Western literature is about the single character fighting something up against something, fighting a certain kind of what some people might call the Western loneliness, which is, I think, really interesting, especially when you consider so many of those characters are some of the most beautiful parts of the world. But anyway, my next question is this. So many of the scenes in Ruthie Fear take place in a group. So there isn't that the usual, I think, Western trope where characters are dealing with something almost completely alone. So I'm thinking of the shooting of the elk, Father Mike's drowning. There's several of these events where she's part of, she's witnessing something that the whole town is witnessing. So it struck me that you're in this novel, we're writing not only Ruthie's experience, but something that would go down as something that the town understood as its collective experience as well. And I wondered if that was something you'd set out to do early on, or that was just your experience about what would happen to somebody like Ruthie.
Again, that was definitely, you know, one of the ideas that I had going into the novel was to try and write, you know, from a collective, because again, it feels like so much of where we're at in the West today, you know, one person, you know, there's this idea in so much Western literature, yeah, that one person can fix it, or one person makes this vast difference. And, you know, that's kind of almost the myth of the West, is, you know, the single person leaving the East Coast and coming West, and you know, finding riches in the hills, or creating a town, basically, you know, one person starts a town somewhere deep in the mountains, or a mine, or whatever it is. And that just is not the reality anymore. You know, we live in this, in this collective world where anything we want to change will have to be done together in this way that's, completely fundamentally different than anything we've done before. And, I think that the first, 200 years of, and you could say this, I guess I could say this for the last 2,000 years of sort of European experience have been dominated by exploration and conquest. And I think the next 2,000, it's going to have to be stillness and surrender. And you see this so clearly in the West. The ethos of going out into the woods on your own and taking something and making your way, that's just not possible. We've filled it up. And so now there's all sorts of conflicts between the rural West and the urban West, between rich Westerners, poor Westerners, right-wing Westerners, left-wing Westerners. It's just this sort of sea of conflict. And really it's because we're right on top of each other. And so any kind of change or evolution or progress or a new way of being in the West, I think will come from beginning to view ourselves as being a part of something much bigger than ourselves, a communion both with the people in our community and also with the natural world. And so throughout Ruthie Fear, I was attempting to show that even though the book is so deeply locked and told through her spirit and her character,
Right.
It's the story of a whole place, and nothing she does on her own is changing the course of that place. It's what they're doing together. It's what these forces of this community are enacting together that are changing the course, and the fate of the community when that day comes is experienced together as well. It's not experienced just through her. It's a collective fate. And again, it's been really surreal talking about this book in the midst of the pandemic, which again is such a sort of collective, it's the most powerful thing in my whole life that we're all experiencing together, and that all of our minds and our sort of ways of being are being reshaped simultaneously together. And we're all kind of being, in one way, we're all being pulled deeper into our own experiences as we can't travel and we're kept at home, but we're also locked into this collective reality that if we're going to fix this, we have to do it together. Or if we're not going to fix it, we're not going to fix it together. Right. And that's really sort of the idea that was that I had while writing the book.
Right. Thanks a lot, Max. Now, a question for Sarah. I'm going to try to combine a question of my own and one that's come on over the chat function here. The chat function question is, what research did you do to try to understand right-wing groups in the West? And my own question was, the largest actor probably in the novel is Samuel, who is off screen for much of it, except for those nice sections where we get his voice through his writings on a map. And most of those writings are personal. They're just addressed to Joe, trying to explain himself, but he doesn't do a lot of explaining with his politics. And I'm guessing that's just because he thinks she wouldn't be available to hear that. She's in no place to hear that. But had there been a place where you thought, oh, I need to put that in the novel in a greater way? Or how did you research that?
Yeah, I mean, I thought a lot, I think, about how to portray Samuel. In many ways, he is probably the hardest character to write, simply because his views are so extreme. But also because it's really not his story, it's Joe's story. So, he is off screen for much of the book in part for that reason, that what I'm interested in is not so much his bomb, his reasons for detonating the bomb, his very strange and disturbing ideas about why it was justified. But the question was really for me, what does this character do who loves him when he does something truly horrible? And I was interested, particularly in, this type of horrible action, I think, because I grew up in the inland Northwest, and, I was a kid when like Ruby Ridge happened, and, extremists were blowing up banks, or I had, friends who grew up in Montana and their families had issues with militia and that kind of thing. And so, you just sort of see, obviously, that it's around. I grew up in Spokane, and, for much of the time I was growing up, we had the Aryan nations next door across the border in Idaho. And, you were aware of these things. And I love the West, but I also was kind of interested in, why do we have so much of this here? So some of it was sort of looking at where does, like I said earlier, that kind of those traits that we think of as traditionally stereotypically positive Western traits, independence, kind of, close ties to a small community, feeling perhaps separated from decision makers who are far away, and kind of looking at how that might actually play out in someone's life. Samuel is interesting because I did make the choice ultimately to have him be someone who was clearly kind of a seeker, in a not so positive sense. He has experienced difficult events in his life. We come to see what those are over the course of the book. And I think it becomes clear to Joe and then to the reader that this is someone who is just looking for meaning in a lot of places. And most of those places are not good. So he, in researching that, I certainly did a lot of research in the sense of seeing what kinds of different groups and mindsets were active in the American West, reading sort of academic texts about it, certainly news stories, even, seeing, as we all, I think, have become more aware in the last few years of sort of seeing the degree to which the internet has fostered some of these ideas in more recent years, and kind of seeing the common threads between these different viewpoints and where they diverge. Samuel is kind of an interesting character because Joe notices he finds a lot of reasons to reject various ideas after kind of following them for a while. It's almost like his heart isn't really in it. But at the same time, he does hold disturbing views. I mean, he has clearly got some racist and white supremacist ideas, and he will voice them. And so the thing that was interesting to me in this book was not so much those ideas, but how Joe reacted to them. She is in a tough place. She really loves her brother. She was orphaned when she was 10 and he was 17, and he has been sort of a surrogate parent to her. He has gone above and beyond to take care of her and protect her. And she loves him, and he has shown love to her. And she can't deny that. But at the same time, at the beginning of this novel, when he, commits this act of terrorism, she sort of tries to deny it, but we get the sense that she deep down does know it was him right away. She doesn't spend a lot of the book, denying that he did this. So I think we really see her just have to try and deal with the question of, can I still love him? Can I hate what he did? Have I somehow contributed to this by not challenging him strongly enough? She really has to decide, has she kind of brushed off? Has she tried to justify or mitigate what he has sort of become over the years? And now that he has done this terrible thing, what are her sort of responsibilities? What does her loyalty mean? Is there still value in caring about him and letting him know that? And I think that's something that comes together at the end of the novel. But it's not something where I wanted it to be like easy answers. I really wanted her to have to face that, and we see her do that over the course of the novel. And I think that is really the central conflict for her.
Right. No, that's great, Sarah. Another question from the audience, and you've already answered some of this, Max, but it has to do with Western tropes, and the question is this. Ruthie Fear has been described as a new type of Western. How does your novel move the Western into new territory, and how does it maintain some of the traditions?
Yeah, well, part of it I did sort of speak about of having both, having sort of the fantastical feeling of the wild interwoven into the fabric of the kind of gritty day-to-day real. But yeah, there were several other things that I was thinking about as I wrote this book. And the first one was just sort of right from the beginning, where do I point the camera? And, the character at the heart of this is a young woman, who grows up in a trailer. She never in her entire life rides a horse. You know, she watches horses at times, but she dreams of living in Las Vegas. You know, she is absolutely a part of the natural world, but in a way that, you know, I grew up reading a lot of books that took place on ranches or with cowboys or certain kind of characters that I found myself so much more interested in the people who are more on the margins of this world, the people who, you know, drive by the ranches where they used to hunt, and the people who are kind of being pushed out of the West in a strange way. And so, yeah, it was really important to me to kind of tell a different kind of a Western story. And then to tell a story that, and I guess this sort of fits in with the second part of the question. I really wanted to write a book in which the wolf on page 1 wins at the end. And I didn't know how.
Mighty big comeback.
I didn't know how I was going to do that, but that there felt like a way in which there's this huge trope, you know, starting of man sort of versus nature in the West, and man surviving and overcoming in a certain way.
Right.
And I wanted the arc to be the opposite of that. But at the same time, speaking of the things that are, you know, some of the traditions that are in the book, you know, I think that the sort of the totems, these sort of deeper spirits in the West, like wolves and bears and ravens and you know, the mountains. These are so important to me. You know, it's one of the huge questions of my life as a human being, not only as a writer, of, you know, what does it mean to be a white Westerner? You know, I was born here. There's nowhere else I feel at home. When I was a little kid, I was raised in Christian church, but I instinctively felt so much more connected to the you know, the Native American stories that we were getting in school when I was in, you know, kindergarten, first grade, the Salish and Blackfoot mythology, you know, where that animal is a spirit and that mountain is holy. That made so much more sense to me because that was what I was looking at every day, and I could just feel the holiness in that mountain, and that there must be some story behind its creation, and through the story of that mountain's creation I could learn something about myself in this place. And so as I got older, and where I find myself today is this complicated place of still feeling more connected to this place than anywhere else on earth, but also knowing that I'm a part of the culture that is reshaping it and eradicating, you know, those stories that I felt so connected to as a child. And so, you know, that conflict is always going to be at the heart of my work. And so there's always going to be this sense of bringing in, you know, these sort of deep, you know, totemic objects that have been here for as long as human beings have been in this land, and that have shaped, you know, Western literature, both in indigenous cultures and in white cultures. And then there's also going to be the sense of my own struggle to reckon with. I think characters in my book, and in all my books, are going to be trying to do in one way or another.
You know, I really did appreciate the fact too that you put, I mean, that your main character isn't somebody who's looking on stuff from the outside. She's deeply in the middle of it. So for instance, during that sort of horrible scene where a whole bunch of elk are shot down sort of simultaneously, I appreciated the fact that you put her right in there. I mean, she's participating. So the pressure on her is not the pressure of looking and judging from the outside. She's part of everything. So I just wanted to say I like that aspect of it too. You didn't put the reader on the outside. We're living it through her. Question for you, Sarah. This comes from somebody in the audience. It says, Sarah, do you have experience with people who have spinal cord injuries? How did you make sure your narrator portrayed it authentically?
Sure. probably the way I've tried to portray everything else in my books authentically. It's interesting, I suppose some of it's just the conversation right now around identity, but I get asked this a lot and didn't get asked similar questions so much about other characters or like previous book, which I do think is kind of interesting because my first novel, Black River, the narrator is a 60-year-old retired prison guard. And I have never been a man, 60, or a prison guard. So I had to do a lot of research for that too. And he's also a fiddler, which I was not. I learned to play not as well as he does. So, I like doing research. I like writing fiction about characters who are not me. I certainly find a connection to all of them. So I do a lot of different kinds of research. I do a lot of research for all my fiction. I like doing research. Sometimes I say one of my favorite things about writing novels is that I then have an excuse to spend like 3 years just like reading a ton of stuff about something I have suddenly become interested in, and then maybe are never going to read about it again. So, it's a lot of different kinds of research. I mean, yes, some of it is drawing on personal experiences with people who, have mobility limitations. But a lot of it is different kinds of research. Some of that is books, some of that is academic. One thing I've found really useful for me as a fiction writer is different kinds of internet communities or things that people put up. So for example, personal interviews can be great, but you're kind of dependent on the one person you're talking to. So for example, for Eden Mine, one of the things I wanted to know about was how would someone with this type of spinal cord injury go camping? Well, it's very possible that if I talk to one person, they might say, I don't. Sleeping, in the woods is not for me. But then, if I were, so I went on internet message boards for people living with spinal cord injuries, found several threads about camping, and I've got to hear, umpteen different perspectives on approaches, ways they dealt with certain challenges. And I could kind of bring in that broader experience. Similarly, there were a lot of people who put like videos online, just saying things like, here's how I drive my car in case people are curious, here's how I go grocery shopping by myself. And I was able to find that kind of thing for almost anything that maybe I didn't already know. And that worked well too, again, for those more specific things like, I am an equestrian, I've always been very aware of like, Paralympians and, sort of people who ride with different forms of disability. But it was a great opportunity to be able to say, well, how might someone with this specific injury my character has actually like mount a horse and be able to see video of people doing that in different ways. So that ended up being, it sounds kind of like, I think sometimes we think of it as almost like the throwaway kind of research, just go like look it up online. But that ended up being really useful in ways that sometimes, books published years ago might not be, or being able to talk to one person, however valuable that might be. So it's really just a lot of different kinds of research. But I think also for me as a fiction writer, it's always remembering that, I'm trying to portray an individual character. Jo is not every person in the world with a spinal cord injury. She's not every person in the world with this particular type of spinal cord injury. She is an individual character who has a very complicated backstory and certain reasons to think the way she does about certain things. So my goal whenever I'm looking at a certain aspect of a character or one of their identity characteristics is to just make sure that, yes, I'm portraying it authentically for that particular character. And it is nice when you get, I got a note from a bookseller shortly after the book was published, or maybe right before, who had suffered a similar injury to this character, and was like, wow, this author got it all right. That's great to hear. I wouldn't be surprised if there was someone out there living with a similar injury who said, you got it all wrong. I think that my goal again is just to make sure, like, does this feel true to this character? And that was sort of the way the research worked. It was focusing on what particular things would matter to her. What would she still be thinking about a dozen years after this injury? What would matter? And being sure that I could research those things in particular. And some of it's just what interests me, riding horses interests me. So there's probably more detail about that aspect than some others in the book. So
one thing I didn't expect, she's a painter. And so there's some very nice descriptions of her trying to make sense of her world by painting it. There's a lot of tension in the way that she's going to paint a courthouse or her own house, etc. But I mean, that's all for the readers to discover in the book. I'm also very interested in is, how did you find mud painting? I noticed you thank somebody in the acknowledgements page for introducing you, and I looked up, I went online to see some examples. It's kind of fascinating. But how did you find it?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something that people in a number of different cultures have practiced for a very long time. I was thinking about it in part, I knew I kind of wanted to do something with visual art in the book. I am really interested in sort of writing about other forms of creative expression. I also knew, I am not an artist. I wish I were. I thought once I was going to be, then I got a 2 on my AP studio art portfolio. So, low moment in my life. And, I was thinking so much about it thematically because, a lot of this book, I think, is about kind of the different ways people value land or place in the West. People have valued this town of Prospect because it had valuable minerals in the mountains. Okay. The mines are closed now. The people who lived there used to value it because it provided their livelihoods. Now it doesn't so much. Jo's paintings at the beginning are very romanticized. She is painting for tourists. She is painting the things she knows people will buy. It's the beautiful mountain. It's the wildlife that is perfect and has no scars or, mangy patches or anything like that. And I knew I wanted to do something where, as she kind of reckoned with what the land meant to her and what losing it, she's going to lose her home to eminent domain, meant to her. And I knew one way I could do that was through the art. So I was thinking of, well, how can we make the land more, how can she move toward this more authentic expression of the West in her art? And so I thought about different ways, and some of those come out in the book. We see her try different things. She's not satisfied with the kind of art she's doing. But the mud painting, I did have a friend I grew up with, going to school, and she is very interested in art and, has some art degrees. And so I had seen some paintings she had done from different places in the world that mattered to her using local soils. And I thought that was just so cool. And they were really beautiful. They kind of looked like very earthy watercolors, the way she did them. And so, I talked to her, and she very generously kind of shared both sort of some philosophical thoughts about what that kind of painting meant to her, but also just very practical things where, how do you actually get the mud to work as paint? So having someone who was able to do that really supplemented the research for me there. And that ended up becoming a much bigger and more significant part of the novel than I think I anticipated it being when I started writing. Originally, it was just kind of a sort of a side point to her character. And it became, very, very important thematically, and for me as a writer and for her character development, I think. It's in some ways, it's a little bit of a coming of age tale, and we get to see that for her through her art, I think. And it helped me reflect too as a writer. I mean, this, connects, I think, to some of what, Max, you were saying earlier. I mean, I do think for myself about the degree to which with my own writing, I am sometimes engaging with that sort of romanticized portrayal of the West and when I'm resisting it. And I think in most of my own work, I'm doing both of those things. I love writing really lavish descriptions of mountains, and having my main character be an artist kind of let me do that in, nice gushy prose. But at the same time, I'm looking at, well, why am I doing that? Where am I saying, oh, look at this pretty description of mountain, and then look over here at what the mine has done to the mountain down here. So kind of that art let me sort of explore that creative process, I think, through a character that I think I'm engaging with myself to some extent.
Well, we have about 5 minutes left, and I've got 2 sort of larger questions. One sort of about the role that environmental degradation plays in both novels. But I promised my students, and I hope they're watching. They better be watching this, and that is, did either of you find books, and these might not even be books that you loved, but then that you found instructive, that you were reading and you thought, oh, that's how you do it. This is a book that tells you how to write a book in some ways. I don't mean instructional books. I mean an actual book of fiction. Did any of you have either one of you have experiences with those? Have those types of experience, I should say?
Yeah, I think for me, two books sort of popped to my mind, and and this kind of dovetails with what Sarah was saying of like searching for me, what I was looking for instruction on was sort of like, how do I begin to write the West in a new way? And I had two books that really kind of opened my eyes. One is called The Almanac of the Dead by Leslie Marmon Silko. And the other is called Blood Orchid by Charles Bowden, which is actually nonfiction, but it's very, it's a very sort of fictional feeling nonfiction, if that makes any sense. It's a very non-specific book. And they both had such a, they both did such a beautiful job of encapsulating the tension that I think we've both been talking about, of the tension between reckoning both with the beauty and the ugliness of the West, and holding both of those things in one breath and in one sentence. And for me, that was the biggest piece of instruction that I got at sort of a really important pivot point when I was seeking to finish this, which for me was my first novel. And so those books were really important in giving me sort of the clarity and sense of purpose to finish a book.
Awesome, that's great. How about for you, Sarah?
I think for me, one of the things that, I'm really interested just in structure. I've come to realize I think very structurally from before I even start drafting a novel. And I find that sometimes I realize I've set traps for myself as a writer. And I see my own students do this, where we think, oh, if I have two point of view characters, I must alternate between them every other chapter, or they must get equal time on the page. Or if I write one chapter that's 10 pages long and mostly seen, all my chapters must be this way. So I like reading writers who help me kind of break out of that and think differently. One of those authors for me has been Michael Ondaatje. I've read The English Patient many times, and I think I know what's happening in that book now.
Could you write me an email?
And I like it. I read Warlight while I was writing Eden Mine. And I think what I like is, even though his writing is very different than my own, and he's, as someone who's both a poet and fiction writer, he's doing much more experimental things with structure than I am. But when I read him, I find myself saying, oh, if you want to have this character pop in once a third of the way through the book, it's your book. You can do that if you can make it work, if you can justify it on the page. Oh, if I want to have this scene be one sentence long and take place 20 years before the previous scene, I can do that if I can make it work. And that has really helped me with my own writing to rethink sort of what I was doing at the draft stage. So for me, he is one of those writers, but I would just say any writer that someone finds that gets them to kind of think outside the box they've put themselves in while writing is someone I go back to a lot myself.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, my clock says 5 o'clock. So I want to give a little pitch for it. So Max, I just have your reader's copy, but I wanted to hold these two up here. And as a parting question, I wonder, where did you find this illustration for the front here? It's such a sort of interesting, I don't know what I call it, wolf salad or something. It's
yeah, it was a long, the cover of a book, and I'm sure Sarah can speak to this too, is a long and arduous process. And I'm really lucky that the folks at Norton, this was about I think the 14th or 15th version, because as an author, you have this, it's very vague and nebulous, but you really know what it's not. I didn't know exactly what I wanted, but I had a lot of ideas of what I didn't want. This is it's an illustration. It's by a Oregon artist named Christina Mrozik, and the book designer actually found it. I had found the illustration on my first book, but this one, after kind of a lot of talking about sort of how I wanted the imagery to both be rooted in the West, but also feel like a little bit of a different world and of a different, I really love Jeff Vandermeer's book covers, and it was kind of like, how can we bring that into the West? And so yeah, he found this beautiful illustration and put it all together.
Yeah, I don't know why I'm so concerned with covers. It seems sort of like a side thing. When I picked up Sarah's book and then started reading, one of my questions was, oh my God, why didn't they use one of Joe's paintings for the cover here, which would have, I think, seemed way too spot on probably. It's a lovely book though. Anyway, thanks again to both of you for sharing yourselves in these terrific books. And adios. I hope to run into you sometime down the road.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much, Ron.
Sure.
Well, thank you, Sarah, Maxime. Thank you, Ron, for your wonderful questions. Thank you, Sarah and Maxime, for these fantastic books. I'm so delighted to be starting day 2 with such a great discussion. We hope that if you're viewing at home or if you're in one of Ron's classes, that you stick around for Shireen Sherrard and Heather Swan's Writing into Inhospitable Space. At 7 o'clock tonight, we have Edward Ball and Robert P. Jones talking about their books Life of a Klansman and White Too Long, which are about the legacy of white supremacy in America. And then at 8:30 tonight, we have Jacob Tobia for their coming-of-age gender story, as they've called it, Sissy. So we hope to see you again, and we're here all day tomorrow, 10 a.m. to 9:30 p.m. So please come back, and you can see all the events at wisconsinbookfestival.org. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.